So Kamen Rider Geats is about to premiere on September 4th, and this got me thinking about first episodes of Kamen Rider. For me, the first episode is one of the most important parts about picking a new Tokusatsu show to watch, specifically when we're talking about something like Kamen Rider. You're basically deciding if this is a show you're going to try to stick through for another 40 to 50 episodes. Now, I've never claimed to have seen all of Kamen Rider, so I don't want this to come as a shock when I say this, but I've seen almost none of Heisei Phase 1 Kamen Rider. I've seen a first episode here and there, but for the most part, I only know these stories and characters through osmosis. So yeah, I'm gonna go from Kamen Rider Kuuga all the way through Kamen Rider Decade, diving into whether or not their first episodes do or don't work, and ranking them on a tier list as I go. And if you'd like to watch any of these first episodes, they're all available on the Toei Tokusatsu World official YouTube page. And of course, these are my opinions. So remember that we can both have different opinions on what we do and don't like, and the beautiful thing about it is, we're both correct in the end. So let's jump right into it. Kamen Rider Kuuga. Kuuga makes a really good case for how to do show, don't tell. I feel kind of stupid saying this, but I never realized all the classic horror overtones Kuuga has. Everything has this intense atmosphere hidden in shadows, more than a few camera POV shots. There are a lot of sequences in the first episode that really show on their own how to tell a great story with visuals. The opening with the excavation team opening the sarcophagus, this fake out jump scare in the research office, the found footage at the police station with a dark figure screaming Kuuga. These are all executed in a way that pull you in as a viewer just on these small scenes outside of the greater episode they're a part of. During the fake out jump scare, you don't need to know anything else that occurred in this episode. The camera POV and heavy breathing and footsteps, they all play their part to draw you in as a viewer. This first episode also does an amazing job of introducing you to the world and central mysteries of Kuuga, bringing up more questions than it answers, introducing us to the protagonist in what feels like a modern vlog style video, given a monologue that explains to the audience basically who the character is and how he views the world. And then once the camera flips, you can see he's really just trying to console a lost child. Showing the research into the ancient symbols from the excavation site really gives the show a sense of ancient unknown powers. Getting a glimpse of the henshin device and how the protagonist is drawn to it give the show a strong central pull and mystery. If you take yourself out of the show not knowing what Kamen Rider was or is, it gives you the feeling that you don't know if this device is good, bad, or indifferent. Introducing us to some of the supporting cast is quick and exacting, saying, hey, this is a cool detective guy, or hey, this is the female support, then reintroducing these characters together once the henshin has occurred, helping the detective to fight off the big bad spider dude of the episode, leaving mystery and tension between the characters. Alright, this next part is a little bit unfair, but it was a really big part of my experience. The point here isn't to discuss the production or the quality of the effects. It's just that this episode does such a good job of putting things in the shadows and making you anxious to see what's been hiding in the dark. Then by the time Spider Dude shows up, it's just really disappointing. This is probably one of my least favorite suits I've ever seen in Heisei Kamen Rider, and that did diminish the experience a bit for me. Overall, Kamen Rider Kuuga is a great place to start this first episode journey. Kuuga's a show that I've always wanted to watch some of, and it's helpful that it's one of the most accessible seasons of Kamen Rider. Available in Blu-ray, and you can watch it on Tubi at no cost. This episode did its job flawlessly and made me want to keep watching Kuuga to see if it can really fulfill the promises that it made. I feel a little funny starting this high on the first series, but I really do think this episode earned its way into the S tier.
Kamen Rider Agito.
Alright, confession time. Even though I once hosted a explained video on Lambo's channel about Kamen Rider G3, I haven't watched any of Agito, but I do already know a little bit about it from that video. Agito kind of goes in the opposite direction that Kuuga did for me. Here I think it tells us too much in an attempt to explain the world. Opening with a storm, its aftermath, and a kid finding a weird puzzle box. This is okay because it introduces us to the mystery in this machine and that it might be important later. But from there it immediately throws us into a testing lab with G3. There's just a lot of dialogue and explanation and references to catch the audience up with the universe of the show. It's not awful or anything, and I don't want to say that that's a bad thing, but I did find it a bit overwhelming with the amount of information that it was throwing at me, expecting me to understand. So all in all, it didn't feel very welcoming. Agito does an okay job of introducing you to its characters, but they're not nearly as recognizable at first introduction. Everyone involved with the government organization comes at you very quickly, and they're busy doing and explaining so many things, making it hard to take in these characters that the show wants me to spend 51 episodes with. The introduction to the protagonist of the show also has this information static problem. We meet him, he seems nice, but there isn't a lot of information there to glean from. Yes, in Kuuga the protagonist gave you his worldview, but in all of the preceding scenes we really get to see how he reacts and is instantly recognizable to what kind of person he is, even without his monologue. In Agito, however, we're mostly given personal information from other characters. The professor saying he lives with me, his lady friend saying he's an amnesiac. These are little pieces of information that I'm only getting a greater sense of because the show told me and didn't so much show me or make me feel it on my own. For me, this made me feel a little farther away from the characters. As for central plot and mystery to pull you in, I think it has that, but it's just not nearly as compelling. The episode is trying to balance between 3 characters and a monster story. The monster story is Big Bad Cheetah Man is killing people and throwing them in trees. The government character is looking to see if it's a monster. The main character has this mysterious past and a couple of mental connections to things. And then there's the swimming character who, contrary to everything I just said, has this really great moment on the stairs where you can feel the two being pulled together, highlighting their motorcycles and outfits, showing big character differences. I think the introduction of the swimming character is fine, but it is another backstory that makes the overall first episode feel a little bit bloated. The episode ends with the man-made Kamen Rider failing to take down this episode's monster, with Agito creeping in from the shadows at the last minute, setting up a future conflict which I assume will start immediately in the second episode. Watching this now with the ability to just binge watch the show, I think is okay, because you can just quickly jump to the next episode, right? But really, that's the only thread that left me wanting to watch more episodes, seeing how these two and the monster work themselves out. Unfortunately, I don't think that would have been enough to make me stick around another week to catch back up and see what's happening again. I know this mostly sounds really negative, but honestly, I didn't dislike this episode, and I'd love to watch more Agito. But as a first episode, I just didn't feel like this was the strongest. This episode has a lot of elements that I like. Organizations with Kamen Riders as technology, serious atmosphere when it comes to the monsters, and a good array of character types. I just don't think as a first episode, the show really displays any of these things in a way that truly keeps me engaged. I'm a Kamen Rider fan, so I want to keep watching just to see how the show evolves. But if I wasn't, and I was just watching this episode fresh, I'd feel a little overwhelmed without an immediate connection to the show to make me keep watching it. I think this puts Agito safely into the C tier. It's not terrible, there are things I like, just doesn't lure me in the way I want a first episode to.
Kamen Rider Ryuki.
I haven't seen much of Ryuki or Dragon Knight, the Kamen Rider Ryuki Saban-style American adaptation, so mostly all I know about it is the opening song in the mirror break memes. Ryuki does a great job of luring you into the dark side of the world straight off the bat, following someone home from work with nothing but ambient voices in the background. But something's hidden in the reflection, following a lady who's doing an unceremonious nighttime routine in front of her mirror, when a big bad spider, and yeah, it's another spider, attacks her, cutting away to 2 people outside of the building running in, bringing us to our credits. For the first episode opening of a show, I actually find this really effective, showing us some of the serious tones of the show, giving us very little in the way of dialogue, but this really big brooding atmosphere that just hangs over the opening sequence of the show, letting you know the serious tones that it can have, and teaching you some of the core mechanics of the show's world, that the reflections that surround us in everyday life can be a looming threat. Having this quick strong opener lets us shift into the more lighthearted journalistic office space scene. Ryuki does a great job with a lot of character introductions. The chief with piles of papers on his desk looking into the company website on what I think is an old Macintosh classic, in a room full of newer iMacs. This gives off great visual storytelling for our supporting characters. Through the interactions the protagonist has with his boss on the phone and a truck driver in front of him, you're given insight into his personality. I much prefer this to Akito's use of supporting characters just telling the audience traits, showing the relationship between the head reporter and everybody else. You already understand where everybody's position is inside of the cast, and the protagonist just wanting to be helpful, but he's always treated like a burden. Wrapping developing him into our central mystery, making for a great first episode, showing his refusal to just sit in the corner and walks headfirst into the plot. You also have the apartment scene with all of the reflective surfaces covered up, again reinforcing the threat of the mirror world and showing how our protagonist has a way of usually making things worse, all the while introducing the henshin device and further exploring how things work, allowing him to see monsters in the reflections, and reintroducing us to the characters from the beginning of the show. Once the riders are transformed, you really get to compare the two riders next to each other, showing what Ryuki can be in the future, but also that the protagonist is in way over his head, and he's a complete stranger to the world he's found himself in, ending in the middle of an action sequence and pulling me in immediately to want to watch episode 2 to see the world further develop. Ryuki has a very strong opening first episode. It gives us so much information, but delivers it in an organic way. It doesn't leave you in a place where you know exactly what the show's gonna be, but it has shown a lot of its cards, no pun intended. Also showing the serious opening and how it's going to wax and wane between these lighthearted character moments, showing off the dynamics of the show. Kamen Ryuki left me wanting more, but personally, it doesn't hit the high levels of atmosphere that I loved in Kamen Rider Kuuga. So Ryuki is gonna land in the A tier for me.
Kamen Rider Faiz.
So I mentioned during Agito that I love organizations in Kamen Rider, and I think Kamen Rider Faiz does this right. Immediately opening up with a Smart Brain logo and this ancient looking belt in a lab being studied when a monster starts to attack. This has a similar horror tone as Kuuga, but I think it feels more aligned with what I think of when I think of a Kamen Rider monster. I like this opening because we're introduced to a lot in a short amount of time, and everything is instantly recognizable. It doesn't give you the impression that Smart Brain is an ultimately good company. At the same time, it doesn't scream pure evil. It makes you think, yeah, there was a monster as part of this facility and that could have been their own doing, but you don't really know, instantly connecting me with something I want to know more about. Faiz does a great job of not just introducing us to its characters, but introducing us to the origins of its monsters, quickly introducing us to a man and his partner meeting his parents for the first time. Everything is happy and loving and then immediately ripped away by a car accident. After a significant amount of time has passed, he dies and is resurrected. His parents are dead, their house and businesses were stolen by his uncle, and the love of his life has given up on him while he was in a coma and is taking a new life with a new lover. It doesn't take much for a viewer to feel his pain, to the point you want him to win, and in the end, you understand him turning into a monster and wanting to hurt people. And then almost half the episode later, we're actually introduced to our primary cast. Up until this point, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the monster story was the protagonist of this show. I think this was a risky move, but in this episode, it ultimately for me paid off. You're introduced to the female support character and immediately are given so much information about her in just the way she interacts. You know she's mad at the world and brings the protagonist into her life when he thinks she took the wrong bag. It's really interesting how much time you spend with her and this new group of guy friends she just made. Eventually they all have a terrible fate, and it's interesting how little the protagonist is in this show, because it frames everyone in the show as the main character of this episode, really with the exception of our actual main character. Seeing Smart Brain on the case of the transformation device inside the bag are a reminder of the organization from the beginning of the episode. By the time the episode ends, you've been given so much to keep up with. You have the guy who lost everything, a girl on the run, and a protagonist who seems to have accidentally fallen into this story. I feel like on paper, this episode shouldn't work. It's a little messy and it's very busy, but I think it strikes an amazing balance between story and characters and the world building. There's no single element of the show that this first episode didn't leave me wanting to know more about. How did she gain access to the belt? How large of a role is the man who lost everything? Where exactly is the protagonist's bag? Kamen Rider Faiz is definitely an effective first episode, and I'm going to land it with Ryuki in the A tier.
Kamen Rider Blade.
There is so much going on in the first couple minutes of Kamen Rider Blade that it's hard not to lean forward in your seat and want to take it in a little bit more. It's frantic with tight cuts, and unlike most of the first episodes I've seen so far, it starts off with a Kamen Rider fight. You have one Kamen Rider fighting bad guy, a remote team giving updates and tactical advice. You instantly know the one thing you need to know. This is an organized group and they fight monsters. You don't know everything you need to know about the Kamen Riders, but you know enough to see the basics. And right now, you don't really need to know more. Their powers and their belts don't really matter. It's the people inside the show wants you to attach yourself to. Showing our protagonist struggle to keep up with the first fight. Showing he's now homeless and stuck living with a reporter who wants to investigate his organization. You get great insights into the organization. The person in charge, that it's like a paramilitary type operation. The rival or antagonist's drive for power. Everything is just so neatly presented to you with almost no downtime in the show. Whenever the show stops to talk or laugh, it's still holding up its end of the storytelling. For me, Kamen Rider Blade was the perfect mirror for Kamen Rider Agito. It has a lot of the same elements going on, but it's done in a much more concise way. The first episode ultimately ends on a note of betrayal, giving us enough motivation to want to press on and further investigate. If I have one complaint with Blade, it's probably the protagonist. I understand that we're on a hero's journey and that he's going to need to elevate and overcome, but he also just feels so small from the start. Think having him struggle to fight off the first monster, and this guy that he admires and looks up to has betrayed him and everything he knows, is a really good low point for the character to start from. That way when he overcomes, you feel it a little deeper. But I think they may have erred too far into him feeling weak and like he's incompetent while he's in battle. This ultimately doesn't make me want to follow him as much as I feel like it should have. However, all of the other elements of the show make up for this and completely pull me in. Kinda hate to say it, but I think I have to give this first episode of Kamen Rider a B for Blade, due to the rough power level of our hero at the start of this first episode.
Kamen Rider Hibiki.
Oh man, where do I start with this one? Now I already know Kamen Rider Hibiki was not meant to be a Kamen Rider title originally. I know it's kind of its own thing, so what I'm about to say is how I feel about this show as a first episode of Kamen Rider. Not necessarily how I feel about this first episode altogether. I think this first episode is really neat. It starts with a musical montage of orchestra and sounds with this kid riding around on a bike. It gives you this sense of levity and freedom that I love, but I don't think it works well to put me into the story. If this was the start of a movie or something more cohesive than a Tokusatsu show, I think I would be saying something very different. It's tonally jarring in a way that I absolutely love inside of a vacuum, but as a Kamen Rider first episode, it doesn't work for me. I think Hibiki ultimately goes in the entire opposite end of the spectrum for me when I talk about show don't tell. It shows a lot, and a lot can be inferred through its visuals. Its use of vignetting and montages to show characters and their feelings are artistically really interesting. But there's never really anything behind it to turn that corner and confirm what you think you interpreted. Seeing the kid looking at a band practice, alienated away from his mother, or at a family table being asked questions, and the visuals showing his separation and disconnection from the environment around him. Then having color as he enters the woods. I think this part is done so well. And as a teenager, I really struggled to connect with the world around me. And hearing him give answers like, I don't know, I like a lot of things. That feeling of not knowing your identity inside of a world that you don't particularly understand or want to connect with. I think this is a really powerful visual image. However, not a great Kamen Rider episode. By the end of the first episode, everything's felt like a dream that's just washed over you. I think it's a cool first episode, but not a good one. It just doesn't pull me in or make me want to watch more of the show, but I can appreciate it as a work of art. I mean, I really love that musical montage at the beginning of this episode. Regretfully for me, Kamen Rider Hibiki is going in the D tier.
Kamen Rider Kabuto.
Kabuto for me finds itself in a really similar space that Blade did. It opens with a disembodied voice giving a monologue about something falling from the sky and hidden Shibuya causing a calamity. I think this is a really good opener for world building and setting a stage. It's not overly wordy. It comes off as a storyteller welcoming you into a story. It's not bloated for information, and it comes off in this sense that it's some personal story or moment being shared. This alone would be something that would draw me in and have me wanting to know more. It's a promise to know more about this story that the show has set up for me. Juxtaposition with the rest of the opening, a security guard senses something is wrong and sounds an alarm, sending a, frankly, awesome looking army that has what I think is a Kamen Rider Black inspired helmet, storming the building in full force, immediately connecting the opening of the Skyfall with the aftermath of needing a paramilitary group. It has an intensity to it that I think is unmatched by any other Kamen Rider first episode that I've seen so far. You get to take the point of view of a character who's not wearing a helmet and is surrounded by all of these paramilitary troops, struggling to get along and stay up with the operation. An operation that was ultimately unsuccessful. leaving some dead and many wounded. This is a heavy scene for anyone. We cut to him walking home, completely disassociated, as somebody tries to steal his wallet. We come across our protagonist, who also seems disassociated, but in a completely opposite way. Where one character, it's the burden of a world laying on top of him. The other, he's walking above everything, untouchable. This is all done in a way that is as equally as heavy as it is silly. Our protagonist not wanting to mess up his tofu, you later learn is for his, what I'll assume is his sister's breakfast, showing the character as the protector and nurturer. The scene in the van shows everyone from Zek's role, the leader, the operations, and the subordinate who wants more. Introducing us to monsters and how they work in the world gives us exactly enough information. You see the threat and how deadly they can be. The paramilitary going after the monster with such force that it's willing to sacrifice a young girl in the line of fire. The show's use of the henshin device creates questions. Where does the belt come from, and why does this other guy have one? We see the subordinate struggling with the reality of fighting monsters. People die and innocents can get lost in the crossfire. Gets clearance to use the belt, raises his hand, and the Zek driver comes flying, and nothing happens. It rejects him and it goes to someone else. I found this episode really effective from the narrative used, and the way the characters' motivations were displayed. It introduces a ton of characters that you have an understanding of. It has this feeling like starting a new job, and you see a bunch of people, you probably know what they do, but not exactly who they are. But you want to get to know them and know more. What makes the leader in the van so quiet and intense? Why does the lady supervisor have such an iron fist? It makes me want to explore those characters more. Kabuto is a really fun and engaging first episode, and I think it's up there as one of my favorite Kamen Riders of Heisei Phase 1. I'ma have it join Kuuga in the S tier.
Kamen Rider Den-O.
I think on this list, Kamen Rider Den-O is one of the only first episodes that I've seen before. Den-O's first episode strengths are that it makes you connect with the main character. For me, it feels like it's just interested in telling you the story of the most unlucky person to have ever existed, and less interested in exposing you to a sprawling world. I think this series kind of represents like the great paradigm shift in Kamen Rider. Comparing Den-O, Kiva, and Decade together, there's this very strong tonality change. Opening up the first episode with the protagonist in a tree and everyone remarking on it. It gets the point across. This is a character who has not been jaded by a world that he's mostly seen the worst of. I'm sure this would vary person to person, but it's kind of like my comments on Blade. He's a little too bumbly. While I found Blade a little more engaging as a character in spite of his weakness, for Den-O, I think that weakness comes off as an endearing quality. Going through the alley scene where you see him getting bullied and beat up, you feel bad for him. So when the sand guy takes over, you're on his side and you want to see him do good. The train is a big source of mystery for me. Obviously it's going through time and dimensions, but why? Why and how does this exist? How much of this is connected to the sand monsters promising to give you everything you ever desired? I think it really hooks me in. Continuing endearing the protagonist is the fight. Seeing this just stupid looking form run around and try to hit monsters with a broom tells you a lot about this show compared to everything else I've talked about. Its lightheartedness is more pronounced. For every other series, once the monster was there, the slapstick stuff kinda stopped. Here, it makes it feel like a fun time and a good journey. By the time the episode wraps, you want to see what's on the train. I found this an effective, but maybe ultimately not great first episode. It absolutely does its job and makes me want to watch more Kamen Rider Den-O and discover the mysteries of the protagonist, but it misses that serious tone that I've really enjoyed in the last few episodes that I've watched. Up until now, most of the episodes have showed the cost of human life and why you need a superhero to protect it. Here, you're really rooting for the superhero just because you like him. And I don't want to make it sound like having a protagonist you cheer for is a bad thing. Far from it. It's just such a departure from all of the Phase 1 series I've watched before it. After this first episode, I do want to keep watching Kamen Rider Den-O, but not for the reasons that I come to Kamen Rider for. Liking a character is not a minus, but for me, I want a little bit more meat on a show when I go to watch it. So I'm going to have Kamen Rider Den-O hang out with Agito in the C tier.
Kamen Rider Kiva.
More than any other show I've seen in Heisei Phase 1, Kiva has style. It's a style I think I really like, but some of it I think is style over substance. It's not to say Kiva is a shallow show, far from it, but I do think Kiva has a pacing and knowledge problem. Feels like it's going out of its way to be more attention-grabbing than a lot of the other Phase 1 Kamen Rider shows, with music that just screams Castlevania and a story that by the end of the first episode, I wasn't sure if my interpretation of events was even accurate. It's obvious they're trying to flip between different time periods, but a lot of that was feeling kind of unclear to me about where and when we were. And I think it does its best to telegraph this, and maybe my dog asked to go outside or I looked away for a moment, but I felt like I kept finding myself in situations where I didn't know how I got there or why. Characters in Kiva make really memorable introductions, like this girl with the knife/whip thing, and honestly, I really just want her to be the protagonist of the show because, I mean, come on, she's crushing a car with a motorcycle. It's pretty cool. The actual protagonist being obsessed with fish bones for some reason and trying to steal some from a cat and then later from a model, you're certainly going to know him as the weird germaphobe guy. He's definitely quirky in this broken down house, brooding and making violins. He's interesting for a variety of things you see him do and interact with, but with the exception of a few things dropped about him maybe not feeling human, you don't get much deeper. I don't think a first episode absolutely needs to have the abilities of a Kamen Rider. The protagonist has this toy bat thing that just feels really out of place. This is a lot of what I was talking about with Phase 1 starting to take a very different tone. This thing just kind of feels like a Jar Jar Binks, I made it for kids, but I don't even know if kids would like it kind of thing. I feel like I could learn to love it because it's kind of a fun, goofy character itself. It just degrounds the show for me and makes it push down that like cheesy rabbit hole more than I would have liked. When we get a transformation, it's cool, but again, it feels kind of like style over substance. Ultimately, I have an idea of how that Kamen Rider works, but it doesn't give me the greater sense of like, what is this Kamen Rider outside of he can do a rider kick? Just don't get a greater sense of the identity that Kiva is of Kamen Rider. I could probably say the same thing about Blade, but you have enough background and context. Blade is fighting these monsters for these people. And for me, that was enough, but with Kiva, it just felt like I needed a little bit more, and I'd probably get that in future episodes. For me, the most notable part of Kiva was turning a house into a dragon. Kiva's not a bad show, but I found myself way more interested in the secondary characters than I was with the protagonist of the show. I did want to see more Kiva by the time the first episode ended, but not for the reason that I come to Kamen Rider for. I just liked that they had a badass female character. And in the long run, I think I'd really like Kiva for the things I already know about it, but I didn't really find those things so much in the first episode of the show. And compared to the other first episodes that I just watched, it just doesn't rank that high for me. Joining Kamen Rider Hibiki at the bottom in my D tier.
Kamen Rider Decade.
Alright, the last Kamen Rider first episode in my list and the most appropriate to end it on is Kamen Rider Decade. Kamen Rider Decade is not a show I've watched before, but I've always been really interested to see. Some of the reasons I never watched Decade should be obvious. It's an anniversary season, and it features every series that just came before it and is on this list. If you've been watching Heisei Kamen Rider Phase 1 yearly, this is the perfect first episode. Opening up with this giant battle and seeing like Ryuki ride the Kiva Dragon House like a surfboard, action everywhere. Even though for the most of these, I've only seen the first episode, this is such an epic opener. This opening scene alone would make this a great first episode because I'd always be chasing the high of how batshit crazy these first 3 minutes are. Bringing forth the mystery of the girl in the middle of the battlefield, why are these Kamen Riders fighting? Why is Decade floating in the air like a resurrected Jesus above a Ryuki dragon corpse? I love this to bring me into the show. It immediately jumps into making you want to know more about the characters, exposing that this was a dream sequence. Our protagonist says a bunch of weird stuff that you're hoping will make more sense later, but their interactions feel so lovable, good and bad. The camera's blurry photos is a great narrative device that just says he doesn't belong to any reality, and it just makes you want to know more. So once they drop that the 9 worlds of the 9 season starters that I just watched, just so effective and pulls me in. The chaos of the sequence once you start running through worlds and you get the Decade driver and all the riders and different cards disappear. It reminds me of like the beginning of the Star Wars video game Force Unleashed. You get to walk through the first stage as Darth Vader just wrecking dudes, feeling ungodly levels of powerful. It's just a small taste of everything you'll be able to do. Just, God, everything in this first episode really works for me. The dreams, this dude walking through fire, dropping exposition, it all works. You're learning so much and not that much at the same time. And as soon as you start to get bored from exposition, it kicks into another action set piece. I think Kamen Rider Kuuga and Kamen Rider Decade are like the perfect places to start and stop Heisei Phase 1. You're drawn into the plot, you're drawn into the characters. You're drawn into the celebration of Kamen Rider, the multiple universes all fighting for the right to exist. It's so exciting, and it ends on a cliffhanger for episode 2, showing us Kuuga in action. So it's probably no surprise, but for me, Kamen Rider Decade episode 1, I think is an all-around one of the best first episodes in the Kamen Rider series, putting the Destroyer of Worlds at the top in the S tier. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. This has been so much fun to do and go through. If you'd like to see this list expanded into Heisei Phase 2 or even Showa Kamen Riders, please let me know in the comments because I'd love to do more. I'm Heisei, and I hope you keep watching.